systematically from the very sort of science-heavy focus that we have been using to explore the question of identity. And we're moving in the direction of sort of my more tendency, which is the humanities, and Professor Wandling's as well. We have been looking at identity as something that is sort of encoded in your genes, and it comes to you through the biological process of development. Now we are beginning to look at the process of cultural creation of identity, okay? And that can include many, many things. But I'm really happy that we begin with stories. We begin with literature, because more and more it seems to me, and I think many scientists and psychologists, and as well as humanities are seeing this too, that stories carry a great deal of our identity. In fact, all human beings, all human societies, really develop who they are collectively and in many ways individually through the process of storytelling. We are incredibly privileged to have one of our own now to tell us about these trends. Professor Tim Wandling has his PhD from Stanford University. Big hand for Dr. Wandling. His PhD is from Stanford. I think your master's from Cal, right? You are a man divided. They're rivals. His scholarly interests are many and wide-ranging. His PhD is in romantic literature, but he teaches courses in many, many things, particularly in Victorian literature, all the way up to James Joyce and things like that. So pretty much all 19th century, early 20th century literature. He's very interested in issues of, he's very interested in figures like Lord Byron, the Shelleys, Thomas Hardy, James Joyce, other writers. He is also, by the way, one of Desdemon's heroes in terms of curricular development and faculty governance. He served as chair of the faculty, and he is one of the architects and designers of this program that you're in. So we all owe him a huge debt of gratitude. Thank you, Professor Wandling.
All right, hello everybody. I want to have some fun with you guys today, and I want to start by asking, how many of you just love reading? That's a lot. Maybe a fifth, maybe a sixth, something like that. How about puzzles? Do you guys love puzzles? Do you love solving puzzles? Fewer people, right? How many of you have this book with you today? So if you have this book with you today, get it out. So I want you to look at it when we talk about things. I'm going to be going really fast here today. I've got way too much material. I always do. I'm not going to get to it all. So what I'm going to give you is a PowerPoint slide, which will hopefully get to your instructors, and you can go over some of the questions that I ask about this book in your discussion sections or later on today at the round table. But what I hope that you do is, if you want to take notes today, certainly none of the babble that comes out of my mouth is worth taking notes about. I want you to take notes in the margins of this book and dog-ear it. And I've talked with the bookstore. They say that if you've rented this book, they will take it back. If you've underlined it, if you've dog-eared it, they want you to use the book. They'll just sell it in used condition. So don't be afraid to just take ownership of your book. A good book should look like this. And I'm going to talk later on about why it is that when you're reading a book, you need to be able to hold it open in several different places sometimes, because you need to go back. You ever feel that experience? You're going to go back? Those of you who read the poem, the Robert Browning poem in class this week, Porphyria's Lover, you had to go back to the beginning of the poem once you got to the middle of the poem. You're like, ew, that's what's happening in that poem, right? So you make meaning out of that and you go back. Right, that's a shorter experience, and I'll show you a passage in here that a student asked me about last year where the same thing happens. It's another kind of gory, horrific passage, actually. I'm going to try to cover 4 things today. The powers of the imagination, what I like to call the real red pill. And Professor Bacigalupa mentioned when she gave her talk that I would have an argument with her. And I decided I don't have an argument with her. I think that critical thinking is incredibly important. I just think the imagination is the most important kind of critical thinking. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is. Talk a little bit about the storyteller. This is a really hard book. Let's just acknowledge that. The voice in here is very difficult. It's often hard to tell whose perspective we're getting, and you have to think about whose perspective we're hearing at a given moment in the particular text. Right? That makes it hard to read, but it requires rereading and puzzling over the meaning of things. So you have to get empathetic. You have to get outside of yourself, which is an active imagination, and imagine what that other person might have been thinking or what their worldview was when they make the statement that you're reading in a book like this. This is my favorite part, play. This is why I read books. I think play. A sixth of you raised your hand. I hope when we leave today, more of you will realize, wow, play and interpretation is kind of fun. I like that. And then I'm going to talk about passing. Because I have too much material, I might not get to some of that material, but I will forward it on to your instructors if I don't get to it all today. But how about the very first thing that I have written up there? Play is the thing. What does that sound like to you? Does that sound familiar to you? Play is the thing. Anybody that sound like an echo of something you know? The play is the thing. Wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. Huh? Hamlet, right. So I made that's called an allusion. So I made an allusion in my slide. People will do that all the time when they're writing. Sometimes they'll put it in quotation marks. Sometimes they just expect that most of you guys read Hamlet. Most people have read Hamlet. So you know that Hamlet decides that rather than just killing his stepfather, he's going to stage the play. And the play will be the thing wherein he'll catch the conscience of the king. Right? So Shakespeare is very aware of the play, the power of words, literature, drama, to be able to evoke realities. He's watching his stepfather watch this play. The play is the thing. Right? It's a very powerful moment in a claim for the text. Malcolm X is one of the most influential speakers and writers on the topic of reading. How reading provides us a sense of agency, how it can awake us to the possibility of other selves that we didn't even know were possible, and also to the historical reality of our own conditions, which might not have been shown to us as we grew up. You can pick up any book, and I want to say that for you guys, textuality is very different these days. For Malcolm X and for me, the books all look like this. You guys are doing this every time you click a link. Every time you share something with somebody else on Facebook, you're sharing literacy, you're sharing connection, you're doing the same thing, you're representing a kind of a craving to be mentally alive, to learn things. Now that being said, I do think there is a special quality of the way that literary texts function on your mind. And we'll talk about that when we talk about play, that there's the act of interpretation. Just because you're learning something by clicking on a link, it may not be taking you through the kind of literary jumps, which are playing with your mind and teaching your mind how to make errors and learn from those errors. Do you remember Dr. Ostroff last week? She said that's when we learn, is when we make errors. Right? Good writers do that all the time. They trick us. Gotcha. You go back and you recorrect. So let's talk about the imagination. Here's, Scott mentioned I'm a romantics poetry professor. William Blake is one of the English romantics. You've probably seen this in your high school counselor's office. Right? What is now proved was once only imagined. This is a claim by Blake of the primacy of the imagination over science. Right? Now, who is he talking about? Anybody recognize that image? I know you guys over here recognize that image. What is that image? It's a geocentric model of the universe, right, or of the solar system, right? So for many, many centuries in Europe, people looked out and they faced the obvious fact, the obvious reality that the world was stationary and that everything moved around us. Right? The problem with that worldview is that it didn't add up. Once the telescopes and once the math got good enough to start trying to predict models of where planets would be, it most particularly did not add up. Because what Copernicus is going to assert in his critique, which I think is one of the greatest red pills of all time, is that the sun is at the center of things. But how do you get there? Right? You have to say, well, first of all, things appear to be moving in regular motion. It seems to be a law of the universe, that things are moving in circles and orbits. They're not making horizontal or diagonal or rectangular movements. And any way to attempt to explain how the planets or the other things in the sky get to be where they are in the old system, the geocentric system, doesn't work unless you have some sort of machinery. I was joking with you guys yesterday, the idea of the chariot just riding the horse, but a chariot riding the sun back to its position every day. It doesn't hold up when you start thinking about the world in terms of natural law. But once Copernicus made this observation, which he did with his imagination and with math, did everybody just automatically say, thank you for figuring that one out, now we know the truth? No, this red pill was hard to swallow because people in Europe were so convinced of the obvious, that we are stationary and that everything is moving around us. And it was in all of their sacred texts and all of their wisdom traditions and all of their beliefs. Right? So no, they did. He said here To be sure, there is general agreement among the authorities that the earth is at rest in the middle of the universe. They hold the contrary view to be inconceivable or downright silly. Right? That's his own view that Copernicus is talking about there. As much as 80 years later, Galileo was facing the Inquisition for supporting Copernicus's view here. So change didn't happen quickly there on something like that. Hannah Arendt, who is a really important 20th century philosopher, I want to just talk about a panel that she was part of in the early 1960s, where she was asked to consider, along with other leading intellectuals of her time period, the influence of science, the interconnection between science and identity in the middle of the 20th century, because the race to the moon was just starting. And is this a good thing or not? She was not concerned. She's a humanist. Right? But what she said in this panel was that we need imagination to go with our science. We need humane values to go with our science. We can't have science abstract. And she actually brought up the example of Copernicus in that talk. And you notice that she used the word imagined. So we humanities people tend to think the imagination is what's key to what Copernicus did. Other people might emphasize like his geometry, I suppose, or his careful observations, or his observatory. But she's emphasizing, as I do, the fact that it took an act of imagination. He needed to remove himself from where he was stuck, where we're all stuck, and to get into some other position, to imagine himself, as she says, standing in the sun overlooking the planets. Only when he got himself out of his stuck position was he able to actually see the solar system as close to what it really was. He still didn't get it quite. We had to get elliptical orbits from later scientists. Kepler. She says in this panel that the question is raised to address it to the layperson. Right? Is the humanist concern with man being adequately addressed by science? I think that's an urgent concern for us still today. And I think it's an urgent concern of this book. In the beginning of this book, what do we get? We get a birth prediction scene. Birth prediction is key to this story, to Callie's identity, right? And Cal's grandmother is holding a spoon over the belly of his mother to predict the gender of the baby. And she's predicting that the baby will be a girl. A boy. The science is predicting that the baby will be a girl, right? And when her son says, when she says to him, "Well, you think you know so much with all your newfangled," he says, "It's science, Ma. It's science. Page 6 of this book. It's science, Ma." You have to ask yourself, with really every page of this book, what is Eugenes' attitude towards science? Does he love science? Does he think is he agreeing with Hannah Arendt that we need to think more about the interrelationship between what we know scientifically to be true and what might say about something like the human soul, the human capacity to wonder, the human capacity to be something beyond the destiny of our genes? Going back to a lecture from Dr. Baudin a few weeks ago, are our genes our destiny? Cal is certainly obsessed with this question. So part of the problem with science is also the problem of industry, of the way that human beings have been reorganized over the last couple of centuries to do kinds of work that are dehumanizing. You have to ask yourself, when you can open this book if you have it, look on page 95. Whose voice is saying this? So this is, I know some of you haven't got to this part in the book, and that's okay, because I want you to know, this is what I would say is like a difficult reading moment in the text, because you're just reading along and you come to this passage that says, historical fact. People stopped being human in 1913. Now, is that really a historical fact? Did we in this room and our grandparents and their parents stop being human in 1913? Is that true? Yes, no, maybe, not true? Don't know, you have to wonder. What do you think Eugenes means by that? What's he talking about? That was the year Henry Ford put his cars on rollers and made his workers adopt the speed of the assembly line. Eugenes is making a claim there. I don't think he's saying that we stopped being human, but we started to engage in the process of the assembly line production, which dehumanized us. And as long as we allow the primacy of industry, the primacy of capital, to win, we are going to continue to dehumanize ourselves. Right? The city of Detroit is an example of that. Right? It's a city that has been treated very poorly by history. The music videos, the music clips that I showed you were Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Marvin Gaye, Eminem, and Dire Straits, all reflecting on the city of Detroit. It's a very interesting city in terms of trying to understand America, trying to understand the United States, its successes and its failures. The last one, the Eminem video, is a commercial that he did during a basketball game a couple years ago. It's basically a commercial for Detroit, saying we can make it, we can do it. But why are we so concerned about Detroit? I think this book is a book about Detroit as much as it is a book about Cal and Cali. Because people began to stop being human beings in 1913. I don't know if that's completely true, but again, whose narrative voice is that? That's not young Cal's narrative voice or young Cassie's narrative voice, right? That is, that's probably the voice of the more mature fellow who's at the end of the book and sometimes pops up, more of a mature, reflective voice. And it's also a voice of irony. There's a lot of irony in here. So with irony, you as a reader always got to stop and say, is that what the author really meant? That's why it's work, but it's also play. And we do it all the time. For instance, a conventional story like this one, this is Charles Dickens. Right? If you're going to tell an autobiographical story, you begin with the basic facts. This is when I was born, this is who my parents were. I don't know, Dickens says sort of ironically there, I don't know if I'm going to be the hero of my own story, but we'll see. You start at the beginning, right? That's a traditional 19th century Victorian novel. How does Geoffrey Eugenides start? I was born twice. Right? Non-conventional. Right at the very beginning of this book, you're getting an ironic sense of the self-narrative. He's playing with the tradition of autobiographical self-expression. This isn't a real character, neither is Dickens' character. They probably both have some overlap with the lives of their authors, but we're not to take this character as Geoffrey Eugenides. Right? But to be born twice is a paradox. And one of the things that's difficult, and talking about science, is that Cal, once he becomes old enough to read medical texts, he realized that he's been represented in texts that people know him as a case study in medical lore, medical history, right, in scientific lore, and he's in journals. So he writes very ironically sometimes about that. And again, in a kind of soto-ironic voice where he's being sarcastic about Dr. Luce and the way that he's represented in these texts. You can't take them at face value. He's pretty critical of the way that the science of the of the 1960s basically did not serve him well as a human being. And so he's kind of critical of it. But what does science like to put itself forward as? These are just the facts. This is what we know. It's very positivistic. It's not very humanistic. Right? And it's dehumanizing to his experience as a person really struggling with this question of his own identity once he becomes aware that he's inherited traits of both genders. Another thing that Eugenides is playing with is the idea of starting in the middle. So Cal, once he becomes conscious of his identity as already being narrated in these medical journals, realizes that his own sense of self is embedded within these larger discourses of scientific community. Not only that, he's Greek, right? So there's characters in this book who are, named things like Achilles or Constantinople, or these names that you see in history books. Right? They're not. There's even a poem. There's a quote in here from a poem by T.S. Eliot, in which the character Eugenides is named as a merchant in Smyrna. And that's the author of the book. He's not a character in this book, but he's the author of the book, and he throws it in there as a little sly reference to the fact that when you're Greek, your history goes back a long time. You have these historical references all the way back to what we like to call the beginning of Western culture, to Plato. And so Greek tragedy, so people often ask about this book, why is it about incest? Well, Greek tragedy, that often happens, right? It's about the muck of being human. It's about the mistakes that we make in our worst moments and sometimes in our best moments. As we're huddled in a boat and we're a refugee from a horrible situation, we cling to what seems ununderstandable to most of us, but is a genetic mistake for sure. It's a violation of a taboo. So that taboo mistake of the incest that happens at the beginning of this book, that happens in Greek tragedy all the time. So Eugenides is playing around with that. He's playing around with epic conventions. When you get to chapter 11, I think there's a lot of references to the underworld. there in Lefty's experience of going to the underworld, going back into gambling. So when you see a reference to the underworld in a book like this, you think, well, that's something that's like, for instance, I'm an English professor. When I teach epic, I say you're always going to have somebody, the hero in an epic is going to travel to the underworld. That's just part of the conventions, like a sonnet has 14 lines. Eugenides knows these things and he's constantly playing around with them. Does that mean if you don't know that, you don't get the meaning of the book? No, but you get something extra if you do. There's always that extra stuff to get. The gene itself is kind of an epic hero in that, especially in chapter 11, as he's narrating his own birth. It's a really funny way. But how does he even do that? How do you narrate your own birth in a book that's purportedly first-person autobiographical? Right? So if we're telling a book that's an autobiography, how do we narrate our own birth? It creates a narrative impossibility. Geoffrey Eugenides loves narrative impossibilities, and he actually calls attention to it right then. I think he says something like, oh, sing, oh, muse, right? So he's using like a Greek invocation there to use his own imagination to go back to the moment of his own conception. And he does the same thing with his parents' conception, by the way, which happens when they're watching Greek mythology, and they get all aroused by looking at the Minotaur. Right? And even Lena hooks up with her husband, which is pretty rare. Right? And so that's how the parents are created in this book. We'll talk about Lena in a minute. I won't go over these questions right now, but you can think about them, note them in your book. As you're thinking about it, one thing I would say about Eugenides is that he's always going to take the long way to say something. You know, why does he do that? It may frustrate you. Why don't you just say what you mean to say, right? Why does he say over and over again the obscure object of desire? Why is that object of desire obscure? Now, think about obscurity. Think about being an adolescent and desiring someone and being uncertain about how to express that. Think about the particular situation that character is in when his or her, depending on how you look at the gender pronoun there, desire is obscure even to himself or herself. Not really sure what to do with that desire. Desdemonia refers to herself as 8,400 years old. Why? That's on page 161. Look at that later. And you've already seen references to chapter 11. Right, who's chapter 11? Huh? His brother, right? But who calls a character chapter 11? Why is he called chapter 11? Does he make his parents go bankrupt? That's what chapter 11 is, right? Chapter 11 is bankruptcy. Well, kids do kind of drive you to financial ruin, that's for darn sure. But I think it's just because it's also chapter 11 of this book, right? So that's a metatextual reference to the book itself. So chapter 11, his birth is narrated in chapter 11. He's the first egg, he comes in there. But there's also probably a pun on the sense in our society that chapter 11 will lead you to financial ruin. Lena, her secret, as Aunt Zoe puts it, this is on page 86 if you want to look. I don't think all of you have got to page 86, so if you want to look. This is an example of Eugenides saying something but not saying it. Or the character saying something but not saying something. It's frustrating. You can read this stuff and miss it. Right? No problem if you do. It's not like you've missed the whole meaning of the story. But what is being said here? What's her secret? Lena was one of those women they named the island after. What is Lena's secret? Come on, somebody. She's a lesbian. How do you know that? Huh? I can't hear you guys. Because you read it? Because her story? She says what?
She said that was her secret.
Right here, you mean?
Oh, no.
Someplace else.
Yeah.
Someplace else in the book. So you get this narrated, and she's not generally consummating her marriage. Her marriage seems to be a marriage of convenience, except for that one night when they see the Minotaur. Right? But what Geoffrey Eugenides is mentioning here is the sort of secretive way that people in the 1920s might have talked about something like that. It wouldn't have been something where people could say, oh, she's gay, or she's not into men. Right? You'd say these little furtive, secretive things, and this is in character. This isn't the narrator saying this, right? This is the character saying she's from. So what is this island? The island of Lesbos, right? So it's like a 14-year-old joke, right? Good writers like 14-year-old jokes. That's okay. But you as the reader have to stop there and pause. What is this island? Now, how many of you have heard of the island of Lesbos? Not that many, right? So this reference is going to wash over your head, and you have to figure it out. What does he mean by that? And maybe get out your Wikipedia page and look that up. I just put this quote in here because I love this quote about language from a French writer and theorist named Roland Barthes, right? The language is skin. I rub the language against the other. It is as if I had words instead of fingers, or fingers at the tip of my words. My language trembles with desire. If you could read like that, you'll have a lot of fun all the time, right? And now we're going to have a little fun. So I'm going to ask you this. We're going to demonstrate this. Are these numbers sexy? How many people think those numbers are sexy? You've been here before, all right? Meg, did you raise your hand too? You like that? Who is that over there? You guys just like the numbers, or you know what I'm going to do with this? 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Is that sexy? No? What do those numbers mean? All right, let's see if somebody else can do better than you.
Okay, I mean, I know what to do with a woman. You know, I know where everything goes. It's always nice. But I need to know what makes it go from nice to, my God, somebody's killing her in there.
All right, I'm going to show you something a lot of guys don't know. Are you taking that pad, please? All right. Now.
Well, you don't have to draw an actual, whoa, she's hot.
Now, everybody knows the basic erogenous zones. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7.
There are 7.
Let me see. Oh, yeah.
That's one?
Kind of an important one.
Oh, you know what? I was looking at it upside down.
Well, you know, sometimes that helps. Okay, now, most guys will hit 1, 2, 3, and then go to 7 and set up camp.
That's bad?
Well, if you go to Disneyland, you don't spend the whole day on Matterhorn.
Well, I might, for anything like 7.
All right, the important thing is to take your time. You want to hit them all, and you want to mix them up. You got to keep them on their toes. No toes! Yeah, for some people. All right. You could start out with a little 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3, a 3, a 5, a 4, a 3, 2, 2, a 2, 4, 6, 2, 4, 6, 4, 2, 2, 4, 7, 5, 7, 6, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7. There you are. Yeah, that'll work. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
There's the numbers again, all right. So you see what I did there, right? I showed you the numbers. They're not very sexy, but you put those numbers in context. Did I turn myself off here? If you put those numbers in context, then you get an erotic meaning, right? And they never show the picture that those people are looking at. Some of you in this room are still saying 7, you know, and you get the pun of that. What's like the Matterhorn, right? And they discuss the erogenous zones of a woman's body, and maybe there's actually 17 because I don't know about the toes. Right? Jennifer Aniston wants to put in the toes. Maybe there's 17, but they never once identify exactly what they're talking about, and yet most of us have a pretty good approximation of what's being meant by the scene, and that's why it's funny. It wouldn't be a funny scene at all if you were just looking at how to have a good sex manual. That might be erotic, maybe, but it wouldn't be funny, and it wouldn't engage you as a reader into making meaning. That's what they're doing there. Good comedy does this all the time. They're getting your brains activated because you're having to interpret. What do they mean by those numbers? At first, it's kind of like, you're like Chandler, you're sort of puzzled. And by the way, if you're a fan of that show, this is before Monica and Chandler become boyfriend, girlfriend. That's why she's helping him with his then girlfriend at the middle of the show. I'm not going to talk about this because you talked about it in class, but I just want to say that this moment in this poem where he's thinking of a thing to do, and you might have puzzled over some of these questions, point out the fact that reading is temporal. That when you just look at the numbers on a page, they don't mean anything. So then when you see the context of the numbers in the Friends skit, it acquires new meaning. And I'm going to show you a passage in what happens at the end of the Browning poem is that you realize that his girlfriend is not only that he murdered her, but she's right on his shoulder. And she's been there the whole time. So you have to go back to the beginning of that poem and just everything that this guy is saying that makes him seem like a romantic sweetheart, he's a pathological homicidal murderer, right? Who murders this woman because he can't imagine being without her or having the possibility that her family might still get in the way of them getting together. So he thinks, let's freeze this moment in some sort of perfection, right? So Browning is certainly not like that. Browning is trying to show us a disturbed character. But our reading in the beginning of that poem, you're kind of sympathetic to the guy, right? It's like, oh, his girlfriend's not with him. She's got vainer ties, so she's got a better family than him. He's sympathetic to us. The nature outside is storming. It's in sympathy with his own feelings. It's very traditional for poetry of that time period to have that kind of sympathetic, responsive nature. By the end of the point, you're going, this guy's crazy and necrophiliac, and he's got a dead woman on his shoulder, and she's been there the whole time, and God has not said a word. Right? So Browning is messing with you as a reader to sort of talk about, all of Browning's poems work this way, by the way. He's very famous for this, that reading is temporal, that you learn something in the course of the poem that makes you want to go back and reimagine it. I don't like to spoil this for the few of you that haven't seen it, but if you've ever seen the movie The Sixth Sense, Shyamalan's movie with Bruce Willis, it's the same idea. You get to the end of that movie and you're like, I gotta watch the whole thing again, right? Because, you guys know that movie? All right, at the round table last year, a student asked me about this, and this is a great example of what I'm talking about in terms of reader error. If you look at page 55 in your book, this is the horrible scene in the book when the Armenians and many of the Greeks are being killed and murdered. And the doctor is huddled with his family, and they're hearing this singing coming from the other side of the apartment building. Why is Mrs. Bidzikian singing an opera in the middle of the horrifying massacre taking place in the unreal city of Smyrna? So you got to have your stickies in here, you got to have your dog ears. And that bottom of page 55, across the street, Mrs. Bidzikian sings the climactic 3 notes of the Queen of the Night, aria from the Magic Flute. The music sounds so strange amid the other noises. That's what my student asked me last year. He said, this is so strange. Why is she singing opera in the middle of this horrific scene? Like, who would do that? Right? And Eugenides tells you at the end of this paragraph, right, of doors crashing in, people screaming, girls crying out, and they all look up. Mrs. Bidzikian repeats the B flat, D, and F 2 more times, as though practicing the aria. And then her voice hits a note none of them has ever heard before. And they realize that Mrs. Bidzikian hasn't been singing an aria at all. Right? So what's happening to her? She's probably being killed or raped. Right? And it's horrifying. But the last sentence, Eugenides actually tells you she's not singing an opera, but he's giving you the psychological experience, the temporal experience in that passage of how the people in that room across the way are making meaning of that. They're hearing this noise and they're like, why is she singing? And then at the end, her voice goes into a register that tells them, no, she's not singing at all. Something horrifying is happening there. And you have to go back. And even though the narration says she's singing the opera, she's not singing the opera. So it's the way that reading unfolds over time. That's what temporal means. It means over time. You got to go back and reread and say, oh, that woman is, and that to me is like a great. I don't say like it's even wrong. It clearly says she's singing an opera. So is it wrong to say Eugenides tells us that she's singing an opera? I don't know. That's what the student asked me last year, and we all looked at it. We opened up our book, and we were puzzling over it. And I certainly had that impression, as did the other professors in the room who were able to contextualize that a little quicker. I think for you guys at your age to read this in a passage like this in a book like this Sometimes you might take a more literal reading of it before working through the figurative meaning of it. So it does take some work, but it's worth it. So I just want to make the case that you want to see the visual as well as the verbal. You haven't got to this yet, but I love this. Eugenides is Greek. Greeks have had one presidential candidate in their entire history in this country, right? And so he's imagining his father. So this is how he narrates on page 185. He's telling the story of his father during World War II, and he then jumps in the narrative to an embarrassing moment of Greek national, an embarrassing moment for people of Greek ancestry in this country, which is this moment, which is where presidential candidate Dukakis tried to look militaristic, put himself onto a tank, and instead looked ridiculous, right? And so people think he lost the campaign because of this particular image. It's so backfired. They tried to make him look, and so Eugenides jumps from a narrative that is about World War II and his father, and he says his father looks like this. But if you don't have this image, so I would say that the people of my age, Cynthia, do you have this image in your mind when you read this? Right, you have that image in your mind. The rest of you don't know what he's talking about probably, right? So you might have to look that image up. And again, you don't have to stop and look up everything in this book, but it helps. It adds in a level of playfulness. And there's a visual quality to a lot of what he's talking about. And there's the voice. When he's going through Detroit and he's describing it to us, he's saying, what else would my grandmother have seen on the streets of Detroit in 1932? I hear my mother's voice. My section, we were talking about this when we read the book Into the Forest. We hear our mother's voices. We hear our father's voices with us our entire life. So he still hears the voice. Don't you have anything nice to say? Right? When you read that, it's not in red ink, but you need to read it in a different voice. You need to give voice to the voice that's in his head from his mother. He's saying, don't you have anything? And then he's saying like a teenage boy, okay, all right. Detroit in 1932 was known as the city of trees, right? Well, if you look up that phrase again, that was the sort of the industrialists wanted to try to spruce up the image of the city and call it the city of trees. And they also commissioned Rivera to do some murals, which are beautiful. And you can see this image, and there's one of them I want to look at in particular. I'm going to jump out of here for a second. The link to this site is on here. But this is really nice. You can, I lost my picture, so I'm not going to do that. You can follow that link and you can look at it. The actual, the link that's on the PowerPoint will take you to a place where you can actually wheel around and see those murals. And you can see that baby and the germ that Rivera, that he describes in that passage there, which looks very similar to like the theme of this book, which is like, what is the germ of where do we all come from? All right, I will certainly get people upset with me if I don't do this next bit. So let's talk about this too. Going into the questions of identity and sort of what makes us a man, what makes us a woman, I think Eugenides' book is all about that. What's the greatest Disney movie on that topic? Oh, you see the picture, don't you? All right, so I'm going to show you this because I want to make the case that just like Eugenides is making access to information that you may or may not have in the back of your heads, I think Mulan does this as well. So we're going to show this little clip, 2 clips from Mulan. Did they send me daughters when I asked for sons? All right, that's what he's saying in that song. Did they send me daughters when they asked for sons? Those of you who know the movie, of course they did. They sent Mulan.
was washing, so now I'm clean and I'm gonna go. Bye-bye.
Come back here. I know we were jerks to you before, so let's start over. Hi, I'm Lane. And I'm Chien Po.
Hello, Chiampo.
I am Yao, king of the rock. And there's nothing you girls can do about it.
Oh, yeah? Well, I think Ping and I can take you.
I really don't want to take him anywhere.
Ping, we have to fight.
No, we don't. We could just close our eyes and swim around.
Do you guys recognize the voice of Yao? I bet you girls can't do anything, right? Whose voice is that? The actor who's playing that voice. You don't know. You ever think about the actors, the voices that are behind there? All right, this is already a clever movie, a really subversive movie. I love that. It's my favorite Disney movie. They had so much fun playing around with gender roles and gender notions in that story. I mean, it's very interesting that at the end of the story, in order to rescue the emperor, the men, not Mulan, but the men need to dress in drag. They need to dress as courtesans to get into the palace, if you've seen the movie. So at its very first surface level, it's in sort of interrogating notions of what makes somebody a man, what makes somebody powerful. Mulan proves herself to be a really adept warrior over and over again. As Shang says to her at the end, you fight good, right? But whose voices are we hearing in those scenes that I just played? I'm going to say there's another level of subversion and parody that's going on at the level of voice casting. You may not know this actor from his most famous role, but again, probably the professor.
Face like this, I got nothing to worry about. I can always drive a cab. Nothing I need from anyone except for love and respect. And anyone who can't give me those two things has no place in my life.
That is Harvey Firestone, who's probably the most, especially at the time of Mulan, the most famous, iconic gay actor in Hollywood. Torch Song Trilogy. It's a movie about a man trying to come out to his family and about trying to live as a gay man in New York. And they cast that voice as this sort of hyper macho male. Seems like an interesting choice to me that's calling attention to that. You probably know that character actor from Mrs. Doubtfire, if you know him at all, or maybe from the movie Independence Day. But he usually plays the kind of character who's sort of flaming. Even if his character isn't openly gay, he talks like that, right? But yet he's playing Yao, king of the mountain, right? So Disney is having fun with that. So whoever cast this movie is having fun about that. How about the commander singing the song there? I'm going to make a man out of you. Whose voice is singing that? Anybody know? You guys will like this one. What? That's Donny Osmond from the early 70s, right? So again, not exactly like an iconic representation of hyper-American or Chinese masculinity, right? B.D. Wong, the actor B.D. Wong, plays his voice most of the time. But in that song, it's Donny Osmond singing. I think the Disney people were messing with the audience, at least people who might hear those echoes, or later on come to understand them. I treat Mulan just like a text, just like we're teaching this as a text. You got to go back and you got to look at those Rivera murals and deepen your understanding of the text. I am just about out of time, so I'm not going to talk a lot about passing. I've got some scholarly references here to the idea of passing, and you can look at those if you want to. But I do think that the word pass and the idea of a passport is really important to this book. In this particular scene, when they're trying to get out of the Holocaust, the official looked up and he's taking a passport. And not only is he passing as French in the scene, which means to pretend to be one identity that you're not, he's pretending to be French, he's getting a passport, and he's also pretending to be married. Right? He does all those things, and the marriage is really taboo. Right? When she goes to look for work later on, when Desdemonia goes to look for it, this is a really important question asked in the language of African Americans, what we might call Ebonics, right? What you is. Because in this particular situation, it would pay for her to be African American. They're the only ones getting any work. If she wants to work in that particular job, she needs to pass as African American. And they're looking at her, and she's representing this kind of in-betweenness. That's what scholars of passing and identity, and why Eugenides' book is so interesting, because he really brings the ethnic back into the white. That category has sort of been emptied out in many discussions. My last clip would have been from the movie 6 Degrees of Separation. Your instructors can show it to you if you want, but I'll leave 2 minutes for questions or comments. because I think that's enough material right now. You guys gonna go watch Milan? Think about it some more? No questions?